fishless because fish can't get over the waterfalls. The frogs have not evolved defenses. The tadpoles are not toxic, they can't hide, they're not camouflaged. And over the last 50, 60 years, government agencies and fishing groups have been flying over the Sierra Nevadas, dropping out hundreds of thousands of baby trout into the lakes, and they eat the tadpoles. Sierra Nevada yellow-legged frogs pretty much cannot coexist with the fish, they all get eaten. So the yellow-legged frogs used to be perhaps the most abundant frog in California. Now they're completely gone from 92% of their historic localities, in large part due to fish. If you remove the fish from the ponds, then the frogs can come back within a year or two, but there's a big fishing lobby that does not want the fish removed. Red swamp crayfish are a problem. They're from the southeastern U.S., and fishermen use them as bait. They escape, and they've become established in Southern California up through Big Sur, in Spain and Portugal as well. They like to eat newts and salamanders, California red-legged frogs. One of the biggest problems worldwide, one of the worst invasive species, is the American bullfrog, largest frog in North America. They're native to the eastern half of the country, and they got brought here in the 1890s. California gold miners had eaten through most of the red-legged frogs, so some entrepreneur thought it would be a good idea to bring in American bullfrogs and raise them and sell them. They escaped and took over California, Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, Colorado, lots of the American West, and they are a very large frog. They have a big mouth, and they eat all kinds of native wildlife and cause lots of problems. And most of these invasive species are very difficult to eradicate. Pollution and pesticides are a problem for frogs because they're spending a lot of time in the water, and they have permeable skin, so they're absorbing any chemical that gets in the water. Pollution's coming from people's houses, detergent, people's cars, antifreeze, and then we like to put our factories right on the edges of rivers, so a lot of bad stuff comes straight into the water. Pollutants and pesticides get sprayed from airplanes on large farms, and they get taken up into the airstream, taken away for perhaps hundreds of miles, where they accumulate on mountaintops, perhaps in national parks, and then gravity eventually brings everything down into the water bodies where the amphibians breed. So one big problem, coal combustion residues. When we burn coal, there's ash left over. America gets half our electricity from coal, so we produce about 30 million tons of coal ash every year. A recent study looked at southern leopard frogs, and they raised the tadpoles on naturally occurring levels of this coal ash substrate that would be found near the coal plants. 90% of the tadpoles got deformed mouth parts, and they metamorphosed 30 days late, and they weighed about 30% less than the control frogs. So a lot of this coal ash in the atmosphere, and it leaches out into the rivers and streams, and it's full of heavy metals that cause problems. Pesticides are a big problem. There's 18,000 plus registered pesticides in the US. One of them, atrazine, perhaps the most commonly used herbicide in the world, got banned in the European Union in 2004, produced by a Swiss company called Syngenta, the world's largest pesticide company, and they still sell 80 million pounds of it in America each year. And Syngenta is celebrating 50 years of atrazine. Atrazine weakens frogs' immune defenses. It causes hermaphroditism, and it can cause complete sex reversal at 2.5 parts per billion, which is below the legal limit. So it can turn a male frog into a female that can mate with a male frog and produce offspring. So just one of 18,000 pesticides in America. Global warming and climate change are a problem for frogs because they're very sensitive to temperature changes and precipitation changes. They're very dependent on having correct moisture levels. In the tropics, in the montane cloud forests, up in the mountains, in tropical countries, there's usually very high amphibian biodiversity. Panama and Costa Rica, there's sites that once had 60 plus amphibian species at certain sites. And a lot of these cloud forest frogs are terrestrial breeders. They're dependent on that moist leaf litter. What global warming does is it raises the cloud levels, and so basically all that moisture is moving up the mountain and drying up habitat. So it's causing a lot of problems for frogs that live in the mountains. This is the boreal chorus frog. They live in Yellowstone National Park, world's oldest national park. It's been protected since 1872. In Yellowstone National Park, there have been persistent droughts for the last 50 years. And in the last 20 years, about a fourth of the ponds in the park have dried up. 3 of the 4 amphibian species in the park are now on the decline. So that's the effect of global warming in the world's oldest national park. Columbia spotted frog lives there, also having trouble. Here's another barred frog, Flay's barred frog. It has a blue eye. And they're having a lot of trouble because of the chytrid fungus, which causes a potentially lethal skin disease called chytridiomycosis. That's what I did my PhD on. And chytridiomycosis is spreading, chytrid fungus is spreading rapidly around the world because we ship about 100 million amphibians around the world each year for pets, food, bait, laboratory usage, and for zoos, and with very little disease testing or quarantine. So the chytrid fungus, it's a skin disease. It's got waterborne zoospores. A sick frog gets shipped to some other part of the planet, and either its owner sets it free on purpose or it escapes, or the water it was held in goes out into the environment. And the chytrid fungus does a very good job living anywhere where it's cool and moist. So especially up in the mountains, North Cascades, Sierra Nevadas, the Andes, Queensland, Australia, and the Great Dividing Range. Lots of problems with chytrid fungus. And it's driven about 100 amphibian species to complete extinction in the last 30 years. So in terms of biodiversity, it's the worst disease ever recorded for any type of organism, not just frogs.
What was the decline numbers that you were?
It's driven about 100 amphibian species to complete extinction.
Thank you.
And it's still on the move. And just like with just about any wildlife disease, it's virtually impossible to eradicate it from the wild. To date, there's no known way to eradicate it from the wild once it arrives somewhere. Rhinovirus is another bad amphibian disease, but in reality, there's many diseases that have yet to be identified. Panamanian golden frog, they're almost extinct from the wild. This is at a captive breeding facility in Panama. Stony Creek frogs I found at one site in Australia that all had these warts on them and no one could identify it. So basically, chytrid fungus, which has driven 100 species to complete extinction, we didn't even know it existed until 1998. If we keep shipping amphibians all around the world, even if we're testing them all for chytrid fungus, which is definitely not happening yet, there's still lots of other diseases that are going to be passing through because you can't test for diseases that you don't even know exist. Limb deformities are on the rise in the last couple decades. Say Pacific chorus frog from Aptos down in Santa Cruz County. He's got 8 legs. I saw a picture of one with 16 legs. Obviously, it's hard to escape your predator. Hard to hop around when you have that many legs. And this is from eutrophication, farm runoff, changing the water quality and pesticides, weakening immune defenses. What happens is the extra nutrients in the water, it facilitates the growth of algae, more snails. Snails are an intermediary host of a trematode parasite that burrows into the developing hind limbs of tadpoles and causes bad limb deformities. So frogs and other amphibians are really important for a variety of reasons. They're eating ticks, mosquitoes, and flies that carry diseases we don't want, like malaria, dengue fever, West Nile virus, leishmaniasis. So they're keeping us healthy. They're also eating pests of our agricultural crops. So they help us out in a lot of ways. Tadpoles are eating algae, filtering the water that then ends up in our community filtration system, so they lower the cost of our water. And they're an integral part of the food web. Not only are they eating lots of things, but they're food for birds, snakes, fish, monkeys, beetles, dragonflies, lots of animals depend on frogs as a source of food, and if frogs disappear, then lots of other wildlife has problems. They're bioindicators, meaning they're one of the first species to exhibit problems when there's something going wrong in the environment. So they're telling us something's wrong. And they're bioindicators for a few reasons. They've got the permeable skin, they can absorb pollutants and pesticides. They're amphibious, so they're dependent on healthy land and healthy water. If anything goes wrong on either, they're going to have trouble. And also, they're very slow to move. if you chop down a forest, perhaps a bird could fly off to the next forest, but frogs don't do a very good job moving. They're slow, they have to cross roads, they're going to end up in places where there's no cover, they're going to get eaten, have lots of problems. Some of them are just trained to just return to their natal pond where they were born. They don't want to disperse, so if something goes wrong in their habitat, then they've got trouble. And they've been around in more or less their current form for about 250 million years. They've survived asteroid crashes, ice ages, volcanic explosions, outlived the dinosaurs, so they're very strong creatures. Yet in the last half century, we've driven about a third of them to extinction. And they're very important in medical research. About 10% of Nobel Prizes in physiology and medicine have come from research that depended on amphibians. So when an amphibian species disappears, there goes any potential to benefit human health through the continued existence of that species. There were 2 frog species in Australia, the southern and northern gastric brooding frogs, only frogs known to have females that would swallow their eggs and tadpoles. They'd shut off their gastric juices, and then the young could develop safely in the mother's stomach for about a month, and then she'd open her mouth and spit out the young. So both those species went extinct within about 2 years of being found by humans, and it was thought that they'd lead to a potential cure for ulcers, but they both disappeared. So that's what happens when amphibians go extinct. And finally, frogs are cool. So we shouldn't need any other reason to save the frogs. People like them, kids like them. They have every bit as much right to exist on this planet as do we. So it's important that we make the necessary sacrifices to protect them. And luckily there's lots of ways that all of you and anybody else can help save the frogs just by improving their your day-to-day actions, your ecological footprint. Not using pesticides around your home is a real simple thing to do, and good for you too. Humans and frogs share half our DNA, so pesticides are doing bad things to frogs, probably not good for you either. Not eating frog legs is a really simple thing. So the frog leg trade, I said 100 million amphibians get taken out of the wild each year for use as food, but there's also several hundred million more that get farm raised, and the farm raised frogs have lots of problems as well because they're basically hotbeds of disease. They're raised in these tanks with hundreds of frogs crawling all over each other. The most common frog farmed worldwide is the American bullfrog, so they escape their holding facilities and they've become established in 15 different countries where they don't belong, eating native wildlife, spreading diseases. American bullfrogs, California's been importing about 2 million American bullfrogs into the state each year for use as food, and a recent study sampled those frogs for chytrid fungus, sampled about 600 frogs, and 62% of them had chytrid fungus. So we're importing literally millions of chytrid-infected frogs into the country, and these are all originating at the frog farm. So frog leg trade is really bad on the environment. Slow down driving on wet nights. 700 million cars on the road. Frogs like to take their time crossing roads. So if it's wet and you see a frog on the road, definitely slow down because there's probably more, and hopefully they won't end up looking like that. Don't stock non-native fish in your pond or stream. Pretty much always stick with native anything when you're doing stuff around your house. Turn off the tap. The American West is generally a pretty dry place. Colorado River doesn't make it to the sea. That means all its tributaries are drying up as well. When we irrigate our rivers until they're completely dried out, there goes all the habitat for frogs. Also, hot water coming through your tap, high chance it's being heated by a coal-fired power plant, which causes global warming and mouth part deformities and tadpoles. Not purchasing bottled water is a simple thing you can do. Americans go through 5 times as much bottled water as we did 20 years ago. It's easy just to get one bottle, reuse it, fill it up before you go home, and you're not buying bottled water every day. The bottled water process at the factory is really bad on the environment, and then it has to get shipped to you using up fuel. Use rechargeable batteries. Batteries are packed full of heavy metals. And if we just throw them out, we're going to go through several billion of them each year like we currently do in America, then putting lots of bad stuff into the environment that's going to leach down into the water bodies. Dispose of your electronics properly. Most cities have some type of electronics recycling facility. If you feel the need to purchase an amphibian as a pet, which I don't recommend, make sure it's wild caught. If the vendor does not explicitly state that it's captive, make sure it's not wild caught. If it does not say that it's captive raised, then you should probably assume that it's wild caught. Probably about 85+% of the frogs being sold are wild caught. And how you vote is really important. Vote for frog-friendly politicians. And then, if you're looking for a career change, or if you have kids, tell them to become an amphibian biologist. There's only a couple thousand people in the world working full-time on amphibians, but there's a couple thousand endangered amphibian species. So one person per endangered species is not a lot. So there's a very large need for more amphibian biologists and people working to protect amphibians. And spread the word about the amphibian extinction crisis. Most people still don't know that frogs are disappearing. If people don't know there's a problem, they're not going to change their day-to-day actions doing these simple things to help the environment and amphibians. And also, politicians are not going to feel the need to take action for amphibians. Businesses aren't going to feel pressured into doing so either. So it's really important to spread the word. One easy way to spread the word is to go tell your friends about SaveTheFrogs.com, which is our website. I made most of the content on the website. It's got 200+ pages on amphibians, so everything I talked about tonight, probably in more detail and a whole lot more. So definitely go check out the website when you get a chance. So I'll tell you a bit about Save the Frogs. Save the Frogs I founded in May of 2008. Save the Frogs is America's first and only public charity dedicated to protecting amphibians. Our mission is to protect amphibian populations and to promote a society that respects and appreciates nature and wildlife. As I said before, we were based in Virginia for 2 years, and then I moved out to Santa Cruz in February 2010, so that's where we're at now. So we're doing a lot of work in California and go through some of the stuff that we've done and that we plan to do. One of the first things I did was come up with Save the Frogs Day. There's not a lot of amphibian education in schools. Most teachers don't know much about amphibians, and there's certainly no state mandated standards that say you have to teach your kids about amphibian conservation. So I thought Save the Frogs Day would be a good way to get students involved, and also politicians. I sent a letter to my then governor of Virginia, Tim Kaine, telling him frogs were having a lot of problems around the world, and asked him to officially recognize Save the Frogs Day, which he did. So it was officially recognized in the state of Virginia.
Yay.
So I thought that was great. Actually, I sent him a letter and he didn't write back. And then I sent him another letter and he didn't write back. And then I called his office on the phone and they did it. So a little bit of persistence. I thought that was great because he's the highest ranking government official on the planet that I know of to officially acknowledge that amphibians are in trouble. First Save the Frogs Day, we got 40 educational events happening in 15 different countries. Here's some kids holding up their Save the Frogs Day banner in Bangladesh after hearing a talk just like you're hearing. And I thought that was pretty amazing.